The radiant Georgia sun was slowly setting behind the horizon, painting the sky in pink and golden tones. The air, heavy with humidity and heat, seemed to have frozen over the city. Cassandra Williams stood on the balcony of her small but luxurious home, breathing in the scent of the hot evening with pleasure. Her life was going according to plan. She had everything she wanted: a home, a career, and most importantly, a beloved man who would soon become her husband. There was only happiness ahead. A gift from fate for a woman who once grew up in the slums of Atlanta. She recalled how quickly her romance with Andrew began to take off. Young and handsome, Andrew James was the opposite of everything Cassandra had ever known. He came into her life unexpectedly during one of those parties she usually attended for professional reasons. As a real estate agent, Cassandra often mingled with the elite looking to buy or sell real estate in expensive areas of Georgia. But that night was different. A party at one of the wealthy estates where she was to present another house became a turning point. And it was there that she met Andrew. He approached her while she was talking to clients. His clear brown eyes and easy smile immediately aroused sympathy. Tall, slender, and with a sophisticated look, he was not like many of the confident businessmen who usually surrounded her. He seemed to be a true romantic who lived a little out of this world. "Hi, do you mind if I keep you company?" he said, sitting down next to her. "If you want to talk about real estate, you're too late. The house has already been sold," she replied with a smile, raising her glass of champagne. "You look like you don't really belong here." His eyes sparkled with curiosity. Cassandra laughed. That was the first thing that caught her eye about him: his ease and that slight charm that the others didn't have. She knew that everyone in this world hid something behind a mask, but Andrew seemed to be different. They talked all evening, and Cassandra felt that for the first time in a long time, she could be herself. The man didn't ask her awkward questions or try to impress her with his wealth or status. He was only interested in her. A few weeks later, they started dating, and this romance turned into something more. For the first time, Cassandra felt like she had found someone she wanted to spend the rest of her life with. And although she knew that their age difference could be a problem for others, she didn't pay attention to it. She was a woman with experience who had overcome many difficulties, and Andrew was the one who had given her the opportunity to experience true love. But not everyone welcomed the union with such joy. Andrew's mother, Mrs. Alice James, made it clear from the start that she did not approve of her son's new relationship. She was a woman with high standards and extremely conservative views on life. To her, Cassandra was an outsider who had come only to take advantage of their family's wealth. A few months after they met, Cassandra received an invitation to visit the James estate. It was a kind of test by Andrew's mother. Alice wanted to see with her own eyes who this woman was who made her son take such a bold step, to actually give up his previous career in law and take up art. Cassandra was ready. She realized that for Alice, her past was a burden she could not escape. But she also knew that she had a trump card: Andrew. The James estate was located in a picturesque area overlooking the ocean. Cassandra was amazed by the grandeur of the house, but tried to hide her surprise. She knew this visit would be a challenge. Alice met her at the entrance, dressed in an elegant white dress, her gray-blue eyes scanning Cassandra's every move. "Hello, Miss Williams," she said dryly, shaking hands. "I hope you had a good trip." "Yes, it was an easy trip," Cassandra replied calmly, though she felt the woman's attitude was cold. Throughout lunch, the atmosphere remained tense. Alice hardly paid attention to her son. Instead, her eyes were constantly on Cassandra. She asked questions about her past, trying to bring out all the things that Cassandra had carefully hidden behind the mask of a successful businesswoman. "You seem to be working hard to achieve success. Your career is really impressive. But don't you think your priorities have shifted a bit lately?" Alice asked with a touch of disdain in her voice. "Success in life, in my opinion, is not just about your career, Mrs. James," Cassandra replied, holding back her emotions. "My happiness is love and family. That's more important than any deal or money." Alice looked at her intently, and a sly glint appeared in her eyes. She knew how to play this game, but Cassandra was not going to fall for her provocations. Andrew remained silent, but his tense hands on the table showed that he was feeling the pressure as well. After lunch, Alice took Cassandra to the terrace. The ocean was calm, and only a gentle breeze brought coolness. "I just want to protect my son," Alice said quietly when they were alone. Her voice was almost gentle, but Cassandra knew it was just part of the game. "You have a right to do that," Cassandra replied. "But I love him too, and that's not going to change, no matter how you feel." Alice paused for a moment, staring at Cassandra, and then said, "We'll see who loves whom more, Miss Williams." The warm autumn sun was slowly rising above the horizon, casting golden rays over the city. Cassandra and Andrew's wedding day had arrived. For her, it was a day she had been preparing for since the moment they first met. She had imagined this day many times, bright, solemn, with notes of happiness and excitement. But now that it had arrived, Cassandra had a mixed feeling. On the one hand, she was filled with joy that today she would become the wife of the man she truly loved. On the other hand, Mrs. James's presence and her dislike were like a shadow over the event. Preparations for the wedding had been carefully planned. Alice James, of course, insisted that the ceremony take place at their family's estate. It was a prestigious place, a huge estate with a classic Victorian design, surrounded by dense gardens and huge oak trees. Cassandra didn't mind, although she felt that it was another way of Alice's control. But given Andrew's wishes, she agreed. The ceremony venue was truly magical, and although her future husband's stern mother was looking on, Cassandra remained calm. She realized that this day was important not only for her, but also for Andrew. The bride's room was silent, broken only by the sounds of preparation, soft conversations, and the noise of fabric. Cassandra's friends helped her dress. The wedding dress was impeccable, silk, with a minimalist design and elegant lace inserts. She hadn't wanted anything too lavish or flashy, just elegance and taste. "You look stunning, Cassie," said Lisa, her closest friend, and one of the few people Cassandra trusted. "Thank you, Lisa," Cassandra replied, smiling in the mirror. But a shadow of anxiety flashed in her eyes. She knew that this was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, but she had a feeling it wasn't going to be that simple. Lisa noticed this look. "What's wrong? Are you worried?" Cassandra thought for a moment before answering. "I just want everything to go smoothly. You know, it's not just our day. Alice controls every detail, and I feel her presence all the time. I just want her to stop interfering." Lisa put her hand on her friend's shoulder. "It's your day, don't forget that. Alice can interfere, but today you and Andrew are the main characters. Forget about everything and enjoy this moment." Cassandra nodded, although deep down she knew it would be difficult. She had felt the tension ever since Andrew's mother had found out about their wedding, and although Alice hadn't been outspoken, her demeanor had always been on the verge of openly condemning it. The ceremony was to take place in an outdoor venue, decorated with flower arches through which the sunlight penetrated, creating amazing light reflections. The huge garden was filled with the scent of flowers and a light breeze from the ocean, which brought coolness. Andrew was waiting for her by the archway, dressed in a black suit, and when Cassandra walked out onto the lawn, his eyes shone. He looked happy and a little confused, as if he couldn't believe that this moment had actually come. Cassandra felt her heart speed up its rhythm. This man was her hope for a new life. The guests gathered, smiles everywhere. But among them there was always one figure who did not seem to fit into the general atmosphere, Alice James. She stood with her head held high, dressed in a dark blue dress that symbolized her severity and influence. Her face had hardly changed, but her eyes spoke more than any words. Cassandra knew that this woman would never fully accept her, but it didn't matter now. This day was for her and Andrew. The ceremony went off without a hitch. The priest said the usual words, and Cassandra and Andrew stood next to each other, holding hands. Everything around them fell silent as they exchanged vows. "I, Andrew, promise to be your faithful husband, to support you through thick and thin, to love and respect you for the rest of my days." His voice sounded confident, and every word seemed to echo in her heart. Cassandra, holding his hand, felt the warmth of his fingers, and for a moment all her worries dissipated. She looked into his eyes and knew it was the right decision. I, Cassandra, promise to be your faithful wife, to support you in everything, to love you for who you are, and to never doubt our love." Her voice was quiet but confident. When the priest declared them husband and wife, loud applause swept across the lawn. It was the moment they had been waiting for. After the ceremony, the guests moved to a large pavilion where the wedding reception was waiting for them. Huge tables were laid out with gourmet food, and the walls were decorated with elegant floral arrangements. Music was playing softly, creating a festive atmosphere. Andrew and Cassandra walked hand in hand between the tables, accepting congratulations from the guests. Their happiness was obvious, but it wasn't that simple. Cassandra couldn't help but notice Mrs. James's scrutinizing glances that she caught from time to time. Her behavior at the wedding was more than just aloof. It was an open challenge. But at least for that evening, Cassandra decided to ignore it. She was there for Andrew, and that was the most important thing. After the first toast, as wedding glasses clinked from the hands of friends and family, Andrew stood up. He walked up to the microphone, drawing the attention of everyone present. "I want to thank everyone who is here today. This is the most important day of my life. But most importantly, I want to thank you, Cassie. You have made me the happiest person on earth. From the moment we met to this day, I could not have imagined how much you have changed my life. You have taught me how to love in a real way." The guests began to applaud again, and Cassandra, blushing slightly, smiled at him. These were the words she wanted to hear. They embraced, and for a moment, in that big hall, Cassandra felt like the world had stopped. But even in that moment, when their happiness was most evident, she felt that something was wrong. During the dance, as they spun to the piano's melody, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. And she knew who it was. Alice stood aside, not participating in the general merriment, her gaze fixed and cold. It was the look of a person who had not forgotten her suspicions and had no intention of leaving them. The party went on until late at night. The guests laughed, danced, and raised their champagne glasses. But in the midst of all this fun, Cassandra began to notice some disturbing things. From one of her friends, Michael, she learned that one of the guests had seen Alice having a long conversation with one of the kitchen staff. Another guest mentioned that he saw Alice talking to a lawyer who was also at the wedding, but for some reason was not one of the guests. Cassandra didn't know if it was just a coincidence or something more. Later, when she went out to the terrace to enjoy the fresh air, Andrew came up to her. "Everything okay?" he asked, hugging her from behind. "Yes, everything is fine," she replied, although she felt differently inside. She knew that this day was just the beginning of something bigger. Something inevitable was looming over them, and she couldn't ignore it. As the party ended and the guests began to leave, Cassandra felt incredibly tired. Her body was exhausted from emotion, but her mind was racing with thoughts of the future. She and Andrew were alone in their room, but even here she could not relax completely. She knew that this was only the beginning of their journey, and they would face many challenges along the way. "I love you," he whispered as they went to bed. His voice was soft and his arms were warm. "I love you too," she replied, closing her eyes. But even at that moment, when everything should have been perfect, deep down, Cassandra felt uneasy. The sound of the surf was echoing in the distance, rising and falling with the rhythm of the night ocean, creating the illusion of peace. Cassandra was lying in bed next to Andrew, but she couldn't sleep. Her thoughts kept rushing like the waves on the shore. The wedding day had been hard and eventful, but even after all the festivities and celebrations, she didn't feel any relief. On the contrary, she was plagued by a strange feeling of anxiety that had been present since the morning. It seemed that something important had gone unnoticed. Andrew was sleeping soundly next to her, his breathing steady and calm, but Cassandra felt that she could not share this peace. She got out of bed quietly, so as not to wake him, and went out onto the terrace. The night air was cool, and the sky was clear and dotted with stars. She breathed it in deeply, trying to calm her thoughts. Her eyes glided over the dark horizon of the ocean, and her inner voice whispered softly, something was wrong. Cassandra returned to her room, but when she got back into bed, sleep did not come. Her thoughts returned to the events of the previous day. Something bothered her about the behavior of some of the guests, especially Alice. Ever since the wedding ceremony, Cassandra had felt that cold look, those imperceptible gestures. Perhaps it was just her imagination, but Cassandra couldn't shake the feeling that this look would follow her around. The next morning, she woke up to bright light seeping through the thin curtains of her bedroom. Andrew was not there. His place in the bed was empty and cold. Cassandra thought he must have woken up early and decided to go for a walk, as he sometimes did. They had agreed to spend this day together, without rushing, relaxing after the excitement of the wedding. "Andrew?" she called softly, but there was no answer. She got out of bed, put on a light robe, and left the room. The house was quiet, but she didn't find it strange. The guests had left after a late night, and now they had the opportunity to enjoy some time alone. She slowly walked down the stairs, noticing the sunlight coming through the large windows, illuminating the wooden floor. "Andrew, where are you?" she called out loudly, but again there was no answer. Cassandra entered the living room. On the table was a glass of half-drunk champagne left by one of the guests. She remembered the moment last night when Andrew had insisted that he and she drink a glass to their future. It had been one of those moments that had seemed important, but now that she was looking at the empty room, it seemed like something distant and almost ghostly. She walked through the house, looking in every room, but there was no sign of Andrew anywhere. Her anxiety grew. Something was wrong. She went out on the terrace, hoping to see him in the garden, but he wasn't there. All that was left was a gentle breeze swaying the branches of the trees. Cassandra began to panic. Her heart was beating faster, and her breathing was rapid. She entered the house again, this time with quick steps, and began to carefully check every corner, every room. Finally, she reached a small cell that was hidden behind an old wooden door. This room was rarely used, and even Andrew didn't come here often. She opened the door and froze in place. Andrew was lying on the floor in front of her. His body was motionless and his eyes were closed. At first, she thought he had fainted, but as she ran closer, she realized that this was not the case. His skin was pale, and he was not breathing. There was an expression on his face that Cassandra couldn't understand. It was a strange calmness mixed with terror. "Andrew!" she exclaimed, trying to revive him, but to no avail. Her fingers trembled as she touched his wrist, searching for a pulse, but there was none. Her brain refused to accept this reality. How could this have happened? Just yesterday they were at the height of their happiness, and today he was dead in this very house. Cassandra fell to her knees next to him, tears welling up in her eyes. She could not understand how or why this had happened. She examined his body, trying to find any signs of injury, but she could not see any cuts or bruises. It didn't look like an accident. He had only that strange expression on his face, a mixture of peace and fear. As she sat next to the body, trying to collect her thoughts, one detail caught her eye. On the floor, next to Andrew, was a small glass half filled with some kind of liquid. It looked strange. Cassandra did not recognize the glass. She did not remember having one in their house. Then she noticed his lips. They had a bluish tint, as if he had been choking or poisoned. Her mind began to put the pieces of the picture together. Could it be poisoning? But with what? And who could have done this? She got to her feet, her head spinning with sudden fear. She needed to call the police. She had to act now. Cassandra rushed to the phone, dialing the number. Her hands were shaking, and her voice was agitated as she tried to explain to the dispatcher what had happened. She could hardly hear her own voice, but all she could do was wait for the police to arrive. Time was slow, and every second seemed like an eternity. She sat on the stairs, wrapping her arms around herself, trying not to lose her temper. Her thoughts flitted between shock, anger, and pain. What could have happened? How was this even possible? And why did this happen to Andrew, in their own home, on their first day of marriage? When the police arrived, the house was already plunged into dead silence. Detective David Brown, experienced and attentive, was the first to enter the room. His stern gaze immediately settled on Cassandra, who was sitting on the stairs. Her face was wet with tears, and her hands were shaking. "Are you Cassandra Williams?" he asked quietly, approaching her. She nodded, unable to say a word. Her eyes remained fixed on the floor, but chaos reigned inside her. We received your call. What happened? The detective continued, asking questions carefully. Andrew, my husband, he's dead. Her voice was quiet, broken. The detective looked at his colleagues, and they immediately began to search the house. When they got to the room where Andrew's body lay, their reaction was restrained but professional. David was looking at every little thing, every detail that might have made a difference. Was he lying here when you found him? He asked, when he turned to Cassandra. Yes, she replied, trying to calm herself. I don't know what happened. He was dead. The detective listened intently, but his attention was elsewhere. He noticed the glass next to Andrew's body. He bent down and picked it up, his eyes narrowing slightly. Do you know what this is? He asked. Cassandra shook her head. I've never seen this vial before. Her voice trembled. The detective nodded and gave an order to his colleagues. His face remained impassive, but his suspicions were already beginning to grow. This didn't look like an ordinary accident. Something was not right. Andrew's body was taken away for forensic examination, and the detectives began their work. Cassandra remained sitting on the stairs, unable to believe that her life had changed overnight. Her soul was filled with despair and fear. She did not know who could have been involved, but now she knew one thing for sure. It was no accident. As Detective David Brown prepared for his first interviews, he knew this investigation would be difficult. The lack of clear evidence only added to the mystery of the case. But he was sure of one thing: this case would not remain unsolved. And he already felt that the answer lay somewhere closer than it seemed. Cassandra seemed to be on the verge of a nervous breakdown, but she would have to be strong to understand what had happened. Detective David Brown stood by the large panoramic window of the Jameses' house, overlooking the huge garden that stretched all the way to the ocean. The waves were slowly rolling in, their steady rhythm contrasting with the chaos inside the house. David focused all his attention on this place, observing every detail. Everyone around him seemed gloomy, and there was a certain unnaturalness to their behavior. It had been several hours since Andrew James's body had been taken away for forensic examination, and now the hardest part was beginning the search for evidence. There was something about this murder that didn't feel ordinary. Detectives are always sensitive to details, and something about this house, about the relationships between the people in it, made David uneasy. Next to him stood his partner, a young officer named Isabel Brown, who was staring intently at the stack of papers that had already begun to pile up on the table. This was her first major investigation, and she was determined to prove her competence. David, though more experienced, trusted her instincts. He knew that Isabel had a remarkable ability to pick up on things that might have escaped his notice. So, where do we start? She asked, not looking up from the documents. We need to start with who might have had a motive to kill Andrew, David replied, looking up from the window. We need to find out who in the house had a reason to want him dead, and who had access to the place. Isabel nodded. They had already begun questioning wedding guests and family members, but the answers were mostly reserved and cautious, as if everyone was trying to hide something important. The case was more complicated than it seemed at first. The first suspect was undoubtedly Alice James. Her dislike of Cassandra was known, but now it seemed even more obvious. During the wedding, many had seen Alice avoiding contact with the bride, and the feeling that this woman was up to no good only grew. However, could she have gone so far as to kill her own son? Isabel took it upon herself to talk to Alice. When they sat down in the living room, the room was tense. Alice was cold and distant, but her eyes could not hide the pain of losing her son. Mrs. James, I realize this is an extremely difficult time for you, Isabel began, trying to find the right tone for the conversation. Did you talk to Andrew before he died? Alice looked down, her hands folded in her lap. We had a conversation at the wedding, she replied, keeping her gaze on the floor. I expressed my dissatisfaction with the marriage. I made no secret of the fact that I didn't trust Cassandra. Why didn't you trust her? Isabel asked. She was a stranger. came out of nowhere and immediately began to influence my son. He changed, became different. I knew she wanted his wealth, that she could not be trusted. But I would never do that. I would not kill him. Her voice trembled, and she grabbed the armrests of the chair. Isabel watched her reaction closely. It was clear that Alice did feel anger and dislike for Cassandra, but could she have gone so far as to kill her son? Her denial of the accusation seemed sincere, but experience told Isabel not to dismiss her as a suspect. "Mrs. James, did you notice anything strange about Andrew's behavior the night before he died? Did he receive any strange calls or messages?" Isabel asked, changing the direction of the conversation. Alice thought for a moment. "He received a few calls before the wedding, but I don't know who it was. He seemed a little worried after them, but he didn't say anything to me. He just went to his room, locked himself in, and stayed there for a few hours," she answered, wiping away her tears. This detail interested Isabel. Who could have called Andrew before the wedding, and why did those calls affect him so much? Meanwhile, David examined the room where Andrew's body was found. He noticed a few strange details that could be significant. A glass with a liquid in it was left on the floor next to the body. The preliminary forensic examination confirmed that Andrew had died of poisoning, but the origin of the poison remained unknown. The detective picked up the glass and carefully examined it. There were tiny traces on the surface of the liquid that looked like some kind of particles. It looked strange. Could it be some kind of special poison made specifically for this purpose? And who had access to such means? The details became even more mysterious when David came across a small envelope left on the floor near the body. It was a plain white note with no signatures on it. But when he opened it, a few words were written inside. "You have made your choice. Now wait for the consequences." This was no ordinary letter. David immediately realized that this letter could be a key clue. It looked like a threat, possibly from someone who had serious motives for killing Andrew. But who could have written it? And when was this letter delivered? The detectives decided to send the letter for examination to check for fingerprints or other traces. As they continued their investigation, David and Isabel noticed other important details. They learned that Andrew had serious financial problems before the wedding. He had taken out several large loans, and although his family was wealthy, these debts remained hidden. Perhaps someone found out about it and decided to take advantage of the moment. In addition, it turned out that Cassandra had a past that she had carefully hidden. She had once been in a relationship with another wealthy man who had tragically died under mysterious circumstances. At the time, it was written off as an accident, but now this information made the detectives wonder if Cassandra might have been involved in something more. "Her past is getting darker," Isabel observed as she looked through the documents related to the previous investigation. "It might not be the first time someone has died with her," David agreed, looking thoughtfully at a photo of Cassandra in her wedding dress. But there was something else. It seemed that Andrew himself also had his own secrets. His financial difficulties might have been just the tip of the iceberg. For the past few months, he had been receiving mysterious calls from strangers. What were these calls, and could they be connected to his death? With each new detail, the investigation became even more confusing. Each of the key players in this story, Cassandra, Alice, Andrew's friends, had their own possible motive for the murder. Was it about money? Or old grudges? Or perhaps it was a combination of all of them? The detectives couldn't dismiss any of the versions, and so their main goal was to put all the pieces of the puzzle together. But each new clue only added to the complexity of this intricate case. At the end of the day, as David and Isabel reviewed all the evidence, one key picture emerged. Someone close to Andrew was involved in his death. But who was it? And was it a cold-blooded plan, or a moment of uncontrollable rage? They knew one thing: the truth always comes out, even if it takes time. The morning sun was already high when Detective David Brown entered his office. During the night, he and Isabel had gathered enough evidence to unravel the tangle of this mysterious case. Yet David felt that key answers were still slipping through their fingers. All these different clues, Andrew's financial difficulties, mysterious phone calls, conflicts with his mother, and of course, Cassandra's past left questions that needed to be answered clearly. Isabel followed him into the office, holding the latest forensic report. Her face was serious, and David knew that this document could be the detail that would finally shed light on what really happened on that terrible day. "We have the results," she said, placing the report on the table. "The cause of death was a rare poison. The doctors have confirmed that it was added to the liquid in the vial we found next to the body." David nodded, delving into the report. Judging by the results, the poison that killed Andrew was quite complex to make and not the kind you'd find in a regular pharmacy. This meant that the killer had carefully planned this crime, and it was most likely not an impulsive act. The poison worked slowly but fatally, paralyzing the muscles and eventually stopping the heart. "The poison works gradually. It wasn't an instant effect," Isabel added. "He could have drunk it hours before he died." David thought about it. That meant the poison had been administered before Andrew went to the cell. So, one of the guests could have slipped the poison into the drink during or after the wedding party. He looked at the report again. Among the other details was that traces of the poison were found in only one glass, the one next to Andrew's body. This confirmed that the killer had deliberately chosen him as a victim. Someone was waiting for their moment, David said quietly. Now the question is, who could have done it? Isabel opened another file. "There's one more important thing. We checked the calls Andrew received on the eve of the wedding. Most of them were from a single person using an anonymous SIM card, but we were able to track the location of the phone, and you're not going to believe this." David looked at her intently, waiting for her to continue. "This phone was activated near Alice James's house," Isabel said, looking up at him. "It was probably her who threatened Andrew." David exhaled softly. It was beginning to make sense. It seemed that Alice James, desperate for her son's marriage to Cassandra, couldn't accept his decision and had gone to extremes. Calls, threats, and now poison. But why poison? Why did she decide to take such a difficult and long way? David said thoughtfully, looking over the report again. Why not just push him down the stairs or cause an accident? Isabel also wondered. Maybe she wanted to make his death look natural, with no obvious signs of foul play, so everyone would think it was just a heart attack or some other accident. But that was risky, David added. She had to be sure no one would notice it was poisoning. The forensic examination would have revealed the truth sooner or later. She might have hoped that the forensic examination wouldn't be so detailed, Isabel suggested. "Do you remember he had some minor health problems?" David nodded. Andrew was known to have had heart problems in the past, and this could have played into the killer's hands. But all of these assumptions required more definitive evidence. A few hours later, detectives met with Alice James at her home. She sat in her large leather chair, maintaining her usual composure, but now there was anxiety in her eyes. She knew the investigation was closing in on her. David laid out all the evidence in front of her. The forensic results, the phone records, and information about her threats to her son. Alice listened in silence, but when the detective started talking about the poison, her face turned white. "You have no right to blame me for this," she said, her voice beginning to tremble. "I didn't want him to make a mistake and marry that woman. But I didn't kill him." David looked at her calmly. "Mrs. James, we have enough evidence to suggest that you planned this murder. You wanted to make it look like an accident, but the poison was found. The calls you made to Andrew weren't just an attempt to scare him. They were a real threat." Alice tried to say something, but her voice was gone. "I had no choice," she whispered, pressing her hands to her face. "He was destroying our lives. He lost control. He stopped listening to me. I saw Cassandra manipulating him, and I couldn't stand it. I tried to protect him from her. But I didn't want it to go this far." Tears rolled down her face, but her voice was filled with both anger and despair. "I just wanted him to leave her, to realize his mistake. I thought he would come to his senses, but he didn't. I tried to save him." David was silent, looking at her. It was one of those moments when the truth was revealed in all its naked cruelty. Alice, who had devoted her entire life to her son, could not accept his choice and finally decided to destroy everything he held dear. But her plan got out of hand, and she lost not only her son, but also herself. A few days later, Alice James was arrested. The news of her arrest spread through the city, causing a great deal of uproar. No one could believe that a mother could kill her son, but the facts were undeniable. During the trial, it turned out that she had been carefully planning this crime for several months. Her hatred for Cassandra and her inability to control Andrew's decisions pushed her to commit this horrific act. During the trial, Alice admitted that it was she who put the poison in her son's glass at the wedding. She hoped that after his death, she would be able to control the rest of the family business and prevent any influence from Cassandra. The murder was premeditated and cold-blooded. "I wanted to save our family," she said in court when she was sentenced to life in prison. Those in the courtroom were stunned by the story. What started as a romantic love story ended in a horrific tragedy because of a desire for control and an inability to accept another person's decisions. Cassandra left the city after the trial. Her life would never be the same again. Her marriage to Andrew was short but tragic, and his death left a deep wound in her heart. Detectives David and Isabel closed the case, but they both knew that it would forever remain in their memories as one of the most tragic and confusing they had ever investigated. The truth always has its own path, even if that path leads through pain and loss. Life went on, but the shadows of this case will haunt all those involved for a long time to come.